Have you ever wondered what really happens when fame collides with reality, when a larger-than-life persona is suddenly stripped of its spotlight? We often see celebrities, especially in music, portrayed as untouchable. Their lives seem curated, elevated, almost immune to the kinds of pressures that define ordinary existence. But what happens when that image is tested in a place where reputation alone means nothing? Where the rules are different, the stakes are personal, and the audience isn't made up of fans, but of people watching for entirely different reasons. Let's talk about Pooh Shiesty. At the height of his success, he was everywhere. Chart-topping hits, millions of streams, collaborations with major artists, and a growing reputation as one of Memphis' biggest rising stars. His voice carried a certain raw authority, and his image reflected a lifestyle many either admired or questioned. But either way, people paid attention. Then, in 2021, federal charges caught up with him, and everything changed. The shift was immediate. The same fans who once celebrated him began asking a different kind of question, not about his music, but about his reality. Would the image match the person behind prison walls? And perhaps more importantly, does it even need to? When Pooh Shiesty entered federal prison, he wasn't just another inmate blending into anonymity. He was recognizable. His name carried weight, his past carried attention, and his identity, carefully built in the public eye, followed him inside. Now ask yourself, in an environment where everyone is watching, is it smarter to prove something, or to survive quietly? Because federal prison operates on a completely different set of rules than what most people imagine. It's not constant chaos like movies suggest. It's structured, layered with unspoken codes, and shaped by a mix of discipline and politics. But that doesn't make it easy, especially for someone who enters with a reputation that others may want to test. Imagine walking into a place where people already think they know who you are. Where assumptions precede introductions. Where every move you make is interpreted through the lens of your public persona. How do you respond? Not long after he was locked up, stories began circulating online. Social media lit up with speculation. Some claimed he was being pressured. Others suggested he was being disrespected. A few went even further, alleging that he had to drastically change his behavior just to avoid conflict. But here's the problem: none of these stories were verified. And that raises an important question. Why are people so quick to believe the worst about someone they've never met? Is it curiosity, entertainment, or something deeper, something tied to how we consume celebrity narratives? Let's step back for a moment. In early 2022, Pooh Shiesty accepted a plea deal, receiving a 63-month sentence, significantly less than the 10 years prosecutors initially pursued. That outcome alone tells us something important. His legal team was effective. The situation, while serious, was managed strategically. And that same principle, strategy, becomes even more important inside prison. Because survival there isn't about proving dominance. It's about understanding the environment. It's about reading people, managing interactions, and knowing when to speak, and when not to. And one of the biggest factors influencing that experience? Money. Unlike most inmates, Pooh Shiesty entered prison with financial resources. In the federal system, that matters more than people realize. Commissary accounts allow inmates to purchase better food, hygiene products, writing supplies, and small comforts that can make a significant difference in daily life. So while some narratives painted him as struggling, the reality may have been far more stable. He later confirmed in interviews that he was eating well, describing meals that went beyond the standard prison offerings. That detail might seem small, but it reflects something larger: routine, access, and a certain level of control over his environment. Now consider this. Does someone who is constantly under pressure and being controlled by others have the ability to maintain that kind of stability? Or is it more likely that he found a way to navigate the system quietly and effectively? But money, as helpful as it can be, is also a double-edged sword. It can improve your quality of life, but it can also make you a target. So the real question becomes, did his financial status protect him, or did it put him at risk? The answer is probably somewhere in between. In environments like prison, visibility is everything. And for a celebrity, visibility is unavoidable. Even if you try to stay low-key, your name travels. Your story gets repeated. People form opinions, often without ever speaking to you directly. And those opinions can shape how you're treated. Another major point of controversy was the idea of protective custody. For many people on the outside, that term sounds reasonable, like a practical safety measure. But within prison culture, it carries a stigma. It can be interpreted as weakness, fear, or an inability to stand on your own. But let's be honest for a moment. If you were a high-profile figure, known for wealth and public recognition, placed in an unfamiliar and potentially volatile environment, what would you prioritize? Your safety or your image? Would you risk unnecessary exposure just to maintain a perception? Or would you make the calculated decision to reduce risk, even if it came with judgment? That's a question many people criticize from the outside, but might answer very differently if they were inside. As rumors spread, the narrative grew more extreme. Social media thrives on exaggeration, and this situation was no different. Stories evolved, details became distorted, and speculation began to replace fact. Some claimed he was being controlled by other inmates. Others suggested humiliating scenarios meant to strip him of his identity. But then something unexpected happened. A long-term federal inmate, someone who had spent over 3 decades inside, publicly defended him. This wasn't a content creator chasing views. This wasn't someone looking for attention. This was a person with lived experience, someone who understood the system from the inside out. And according to him, the stories were exaggerated, or entirely false. He described Pooh Shiesty as someone who kept to himself, avoided unnecessary conflict, and handled his time intelligently. Someone who understood that survival in prison isn't about proving toughness, it's about maintaining composure. So now we have 2 conflicting versions of the same story. One built on rumors, speculation, and anonymous voices. The other grounded in direct experience and credibility. Which one feels more reliable? And more importantly, why are we drawn to the more dramatic version? Is it because we expect celebrities to fall harder? Because we assume their reality must match the intensity of their image? Or because controversy simply attracts more attention? Let's look at behavior. When Pooh Shiesty spoke after his release, he didn't go on a media tour trying to prove how tough he was. He didn't attempt to counter every rumor or correct every narrative. He didn't tell exaggerated stories to rebuild his image. Instead, he spoke calmly. He talked about routine, about writing music, about staying focused, about thinking ahead. That kind of response raises an interesting question. If someone had truly experienced the kind of chaos and humiliation described in online rumors, wouldn't there be a stronger reaction? Wouldn't there be a need to correct the narrative, to reclaim control over the story? Or does silence, in this case, suggest something else entirely? Maybe it suggests that not every story deserves a response. Maybe it reflects an understanding that public perception is often shaped by what people want to believe, not necessarily what's true. Or maybe it shows growth. Because prison, for many, becomes a space of reflection. A place where identity is stripped down to its core. Where distractions are limited, and time forces you to think, about choices, about consequences, about direction. And that leads to another question. Can someone leave that environment unchanged? Or does it inevitably reshape how they see themselves, and the world around them? For Pooh Shiesty, the answer seems to lean toward transformation. Not in a dramatic, performative way, but in a quieter, more controlled manner. He didn't emerge trying to recreate the past. He didn't chase the same energy that defined his earlier image. Instead, he appeared more measured, more intentional. And that shift might be the most important part of the story. Because at its core, this isn't just about prison. It's about perception. It's about how quickly narratives form, and how rarely they're questioned. It's about the gap between who someone is and who people believe them to be. The story, when you slow it down and really sit with it, isn't just about one person. It's about how quickly narratives take shape, how easily they spread, and how rarely they're questioned once they do. At its core, it revolves around a simple but powerful idea. Reality is often far less dramatic, and far more complex, than the stories we tell. That idea alone invites you to pause. Because if reality is quieter, more layered, and less sensational than what we hear, then what exactly are we consuming when rumors take over? So the next time you hear a story, especially about someone living a life you've never experienced, you might want to ask yourself, am I hearing the truth, or just the version that spreads the fastest? And if those two things aren't the same, which one actually deserves your attention? That question becomes even more relevant when you consider how people react under pressure. There's a common assumption that when someone is hiding something, they stay quiet. But is that always true? Or do some people go in the opposite direction, talking more, explaining more, trying harder to shape the narrative? In other words, do people who are trying to hide something usually stay silent, or do they overcompensate? Silence, after all, can be interpreted in different ways. To some, it suggests guilt. To others, it reflects discipline, patience, or even strategy. Sometimes, silence isn't an absence of truth, it's a refusal to engage with noise. And that brings us to a broader pattern, one that's hard to ignore once you start noticing it. Whenever a successful rapper ends up in prison, a familiar cycle begins. Stories start to surface. Claims are made. Allegations spread. Words like tested, pressed, or exposed begin circulating almost immediately. Why does that happen so predictably? Is it coincidence? Or is it something deeper, something tied to how attention works in the modern world? Because controversy attracts attention. That's not speculation. It's a pattern repeated across industries, platforms, and cultures. And when someone already has a name, a reputation, and a following, attaching controversy to them becomes an easy way to gain visibility. In some cases, tearing down a successful figure isn't about truth, it's about relevance. But that doesn't automatically mean every claim is false. It just means every claim should be examined carefully, critically, without rushing to conclusions. Because once a narrative takes hold, it becomes difficult to separate fact from assumption. And that's where environment matters. When people imagine prison, they often picture chaos, uncontrolled, unpredictable, and dangerous at every moment. But is that an accurate reflection of reality? Especially in federal institutions? Federal prisons are structured environments. They operate with systems, procedures, and oversight. There are surveillance systems. There are incident reports. There are records for nearly everything that happens. So if serious, repeated incidents involving a high-profile inmate were actually occurring, wouldn't there likely be documentation? Wouldn't something surface? In today's world, where information travels faster than ever, it's increasingly difficult for major events to remain hidden, especially when they involve someone already in the public eye. And yet, in this case, no major, verifiable incidents gained traction publicly. That absence doesn't prove that nothing happened. But it does raise an important question. If the most extreme stories were true, where is the evidence to support them? Because in a system built on documentation, silence from official channels can sometimes speak louder than speculation. Then there's the matter of time served. He spent roughly 3 years in prison, less than the full sentence originally expected. Why? Part of the answer lies in good behavior. And that detail is often overlooked, even though it carries weight. Good behavior credits aren't handed out casually. They require consistency. They reflect compliance with rules. They suggest a level of discipline and awareness. So ask yourself, does that align with the image of someone constantly in conflict? Or does it suggest someone who understood the environment and made calculated decisions to navigate it? Because surviving prison isn't just about toughness, it's about adaptability. It's about knowing when to speak and when to stay quiet, when to stand your ground, and when to avoid unnecessary attention. Those aren't qualities that make headlines, but they shape outcomes. And the outcome here is clear. He returned home earlier than expected, without major public incidents defining his time inside. But that's only part of the story. Because release isn't the end, it's the beginning of a different kind of challenge. When he stepped out in late 2025, he didn't return to complete freedom. He entered a phase known as supervised release. And that phase comes with its own set of pressures. Strict conditions. Limited movement. Monitored communication. Restrictions on who you can see, where you can go, and how you spend your time. For anyone, that adjustment would be difficult. But for someone who built a career in the spotlight, the difficulty multiplies. Because now, every move matters. Every decision carries weight. And every mistake, no matter how small, can have consequences. So what does it take to rebuild in that kind of environment? How do you balance personal freedom with legal restrictions? How do you reconnect with an industry that never slowed down while you were gone? And perhaps most importantly, how do you manage expectations, both your own and everyone else's? Because expectations don't disappear when someone goes away. If anything, they grow. People watch more closely. They analyze more deeply. They question more aggressively. And when reports of new legal complications began to surface, it only added another layer to the narrative. It raised concerns. It created uncertainty. It reignited discussions about whether a full transition back to normal life was truly possible. And that leads to one of the most important questions in this entire story. Is surviving prison the hardest part, or is staying free afterward the real challenge? Because the skills required in those two worlds are very different. Inside, structure defines your life. Rules are clear. Boundaries are enforced. Your focus is survival, discipline, and avoiding conflict. Outside, the structure fades. Choices expand. Temptations return. Pressures increase. And suddenly, you're navigating a world where freedom itself can become overwhelming. For someone who rose to fame quickly, that pressure becomes even more intense. There's the expectation to succeed again, to reclaim momentum, to prove that nothing has changed, or perhaps to show that everything has. And that balancing act isn't easy, because growth takes time, adjustment takes patience, and the world doesn't always wait. So when you look at the full picture, certain facts begin to stand out more clearly. He maintained access to resources. He avoided major, documented incidents. He was supported, at least in part, by voices with credibility. And he returned to the outside world with his name still carrying weight. Those outcomes don't align with the most extreme versions of the story. They suggest something more nuanced. Something less dramatic, but more grounded in reality. And yet, the rumors persist. Why? Because stories that are simple, intense, and emotionally charged are easier to spread than ones that are complex and uncertain. People don't always share what's most accurate. They share what's most engaging. So where does that leave us? Perhaps the most honest answer is this. We don't know every detail. We weren't there. We don't have access to every conversation, every moment, every decision. But we do understand how narratives form. We see how quickly assumptions can become facts. And we recognize that public figures often carry projections that have little to do with their actual experiences. Which leads to another important question. Why do we expect entertainers to prove themselves in environments that have nothing to do with their craft? Why is survival treated like performance? Why is personal experience turned into public evaluation? Because when you think about it, those expectations say more about the audience than the individual. They reflect a culture that values image as much as, or sometimes more than, reality. A culture where perception can outweigh truth. Where silence can be misinterpreted. Where complexity is often reduced to headlines. And that's what makes this story larger than one person. It's not just about prison. It's about perception. It's about pressure. It's about the gap between who someone is and who people expect them to be. He entered the system as a rising figure. He left with his relevance intact. And now, he stands at a crossroads that many never see, but many quietly face. The challenge of moving forward. Of redefining identity. Of building something new while carrying the weight of what came before. Whether that next chapter becomes a story of redemption, growth, or struggle, is still unfolding. And maybe that's the point. Not every story has a clear ending. Not every narrative fits neatly into categories of success or failure. Sometimes, the truth exists in the middle, in the ongoing process. So as you reflect on everything you've heard, everything you've read, and everything you've assumed, consider this. What matters more, the loudest version of the story, or the most accurate one? And if those two don't match, are you willing to question what you believe? Because in the end, the story isn't just about him. It's about how we listen, how we interpret, and how we decide what's real. So what do you think? Do you believe the rumors, or the quieter version of events? And more importantly, does that choice change how you see the situation? Or does it reveal something deeper about how we all understand the world around us?